Order, order. It is a pleasure to welcome you, Mariette Hughes, the Service Complaints Ombudsman for the Armed Forces. Thank you for appearing before our Defence Committee, and we're very much looking forward to the evidence session. Let's go straight away to my colleague Jesse Norman.
Thank you very much indeed, and thank you, Ombudsman, for coming in today. Obviously, the complaints that you have to monitor are often extremely serious. Could you talk us through the role that you play, just to orient us, and then comment a little bit on some of the particular things that you've encountered that you think are worthy of note?
Absolutely. So the role of the Service Complaints Ombudsman for the Armed Forces is to provide independent and impartial oversight of the service's own service complaint system. Our aim is to ensure that all service personnel have access to a system that is efficient, effective and fair. And we don't actually provide frontline complaints handling. Initially, when service personnel make their complaint, it is handled by their single service, and that, to me, is the correct way of doing things. It's absolutely right that the creator of the environment where a complaint arises is given that first opportunity to resolve things and to put things right. But we can refer individual complaints into the system to make sure that they can access it and that they get handled properly. We can review and overturn decisions that complaints or appeals are inadmissible to make sure that the right things are being looked at. We can look into concerns around delay in ongoing complaints. And finally, when an individual has been all the way through that process, we can review the final decision and the handling of that complaint to check whether the outcome is correct and whether or not there was any maladministration in the handling of it. And finally, we present our annual report to Parliament on the overall operation of that system and how well it is working. So broadly, the types of complaints that we see are what you would expect to see from any sort of workplace internal grievance system, because that is what the service complaint system is. It's a place for people to raise their complaints about the things that affect them during their service lives. So the top three areas of complaint are and have always been career management, bullying, harassment and discrimination, and terms and conditions of service.
Thank you very much. Can you comment a little bit on the relative performance of the services, both how they incur complaints and how effective they are in resolving them?
Absolutely. So, very broadly speaking, we don't see a huge amount of difference between the three services. Although there are obviously intricacies and differences between them, the areas of complaint are always the same. We see slight shifts and slight sways between them, but there's nothing that makes it particularly worrying that any one service sees more of one type of complaint than another. In terms of handling complaints equally, each of the services have slightly different complications in the way they handle it, but broadly performance is pretty uniform across the board and has been on a very positive trajectory. We hope to see that continuing. The services are doing very well. One of the things that we recommended in year before last annual report was around the need to standardise complaints handling to make sure that regardless of which service you're in, the complaint is handled the same, and that's something that we've seen a lot of success with.
If you take the number of complaints and you divide it by the number of service personnel, the number's roughly the same for
broadly
each of the
consistent
services.
Across all services, and broadly consistent in terms of splits between officers, non-commissioned ranks, reservists.
And does it vary by what you would consider the seriousness of the complaint? Because obviously some complaints can be very serious indeed, and some may be of less, very important to the individual, perhaps less significant in other terms.
So there's definitely a variance between the complaints themselves. They range from what you would see as potentially quite simple matters to things that are really, really distressing and things that are affecting people's everyday life. What I would say is in all complaints handling, severity is a very subjective scale because it's about how it feels to that person. And what you may think of it being as a fairly minor complaint actually can weigh on people for a significant amount of time. What we don't see is any particular link between the severity or seriousness of complaints and the services. So there's not the case that one single service is having the big crunchy complaints. We're seeing the same things across the board, but those can range from very, very minor, maybe requirements to change something on an annual report or missing some part of an allowance from a pay packet to the worst cases of, sexual harassment, unacceptable sexual behaviour, really, really poor examples of bullying, discrimination. We see the whole range.
As you say, there are some that you would consider the worst, even though
yes.
it is a subjective matter in some cases. Okay, thank you. And then final question is, can you just talk a little bit about what your experience has been about whether putting in a complaint, however it is resolved, then has an adverse effect on a human being's career in the services, because obviously that itself could be an enormous disincentive and demotivator, even in the most serious cases or the most justified cases.
Absolutely, and we know that one of the reasons why individuals say they don't raise a complaint or they have fear of raising a complaint is that fear that it will mark them out, that it will affect their career progression going forward. And more than anything, what we see from the individuals we deal with is they want their complaint resolved, but they also want to be able to do it in a way that means they can continue their work and continue their career without that hanging over them. I've not seen any direct evidence or any cases where I could look at that and tangibly say that person has been disadvantaged because of the fact that they raised a complaint. But the perception is always there. And the difficulty when dealing with complaints and dealing with people is you can't control the narrative. If individuals know that a complaint has been raised, or if individuals know that somebody has faced discipline as a result of something that has come out in a complaint, there will naturally be that association with the individual who raised it. And
yes, final small question, if I may, just because of what you said. It would be possible, in principle, to take a longitudinal approach and run a regression to look at whether people's careers were different for those who complained versus sample peer groups. Do you think that might be an interesting analysis to do?
It could potentially be done. I would have to caveat that with a number of different things, in that career trajectory, whilst we can predict it to an extent within the armed forces, it's never linear. There are always other factors about what people want to do with their jobs, with their training. The length of time people are serving is changing. So I think in order for that data to have any sort of real value, it would be a very difficult task.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So just to carry on the theme with regards to the annual report and the functioning of the service complaint system, I'd like to now invite Calvin Bailey.
Thank you, and thank you for coming to speak with us today. I think we'll perhaps go back to Jesse, or your response to Jesse, because clearly there will be some relationship between people raising service complaints and departing the service, and there seems to be an absence of data of those that haven't chosen to raise any data, and there is nothing in the report that shows that you're looking to seek information for those that have exited the services. But in your 2023 report, you state that the service complaints system remains neither efficient, effective, nor fair, which is deeply concerning, particularly in the case of bullying and harassment and discrimination, which counts for 21% of your claims. These disproportionately affect women and ethnic minorities. As you know, if we look at women, they're 12% of the armed services and about 20% of the complaints that you receive. AFCAS data also further reveals that about 13% of personnel experience bullying, and yet only 13% of them say that those affected file a formal complaint, suggesting that perhaps there's systematic barriers to reporting. Given the lessons from external large national issues like Letby and Savile, I'm particularly concerned about the emphasis of resolving complaints at the lowest level. The approach prioritises speed over effectiveness, minimises serious issues, and fails to identify harmful patterns. How is your office addressing these risks, and what steps are being taken to ensure lessons from systemic failures are applied to the service complaints process?
Thank you. Really important and really interesting question. I think the emphasis for me would be resolution at the lowest level, the lowest appropriate level. There will absolutely be cases where it is not appropriate for things to be handled just locally by the chain of command. One of the reasons we made recommendations 6.1 and 6.3 was around this sense of formalising the informal. I want a system where it is possible to pass appropriate cases back for local resolution, but that they all come through the same front door, so that we have an eye on what complaints are being raised, which ones it is appropriate to pass back for local resolution, which ones it is not appropriate because they might speak to that wider systemic issue where there might need to be a certain level of investigation. So I think making sure we have the ability to pass back where appropriate, but also bring everything in through that same gateway is really, really interesting. In terms of that sort of central admissibility, that is what we have been trying to go towards, in that we need to see all the complaints that are coming in. We need to understand what they're about. I don't think local resolution minimises the severity of the issue, provided that that local resolution is managed properly and the outcomes are overseen and reported.
Okay, but that's a major factor in Savile and Letby, and therefore there has got to be lessons that you're drawing in. You know, the halo effect exists within the military, the normalisation of patterns of harm, and so it's quite interesting to see in the approaches by the three different services. The Navy, who perhaps are blighted by operational separation, the time that's taken for their reporting, take one approach. The Army have raised concerns about this. The Air Force are just going after numbers and knocking, churning through complaints. Do you not have some concerns that there is a stripping out of some of the essential context that points to bullying and perhaps would lead you to understand maybe why the system fails in dealing with bullying?
Absolutely, and you're quite right to raise those concerns. And again, it's one of the reasons why we A, want to look at standardisation of complaints, and B, why we are focusing on the fact that bullying, harassment, discrimination complaints take too long, because a lot of these cases come down to individuals' recollections of situations. As that timeline extends, as memories degrade, it becomes harder and harder to get the actual answers as to what's happened. And sort of tying it back to the first question, I think a lot of the reasons people leave services, if they don't get the correct answer to their service complaint because it's not been dealt with correctly or swiftly enough, it leaves that lingering bad taste in the mouth. Looking at those different, the Navy has particular challenges when individuals are away and at sea in bringing those individuals back to speak about complaints. In relation to the RAF, they have actually, achieved the KPI in last year's report. I have had conversations with them about let's not sacrifice quality for speed. So there are wonderful things that they are doing in terms of case hearings, putting people all in the room together to get those accounts firsthand rather than doing everything on a paper-based investigation. But there are also situations where we have said that investigation was too swift, you've not been rigorous enough, and we have actually overturned those cases and made them do it again. So we are trying to sort of bring everyone back to that central line, but there does need to be further work on what is the best way to handle complaints that are so important, so sensitive, affect people's emotions so severely in the quickest possible way and in the most appropriate way.
Okay, I'll posit that bullies love informal resolution. I particularly liked your pitch to the Public Bill Committee, where you spoke about actually going in and speaking to units and stripping out the chain of command and having open conversations with them. And your language in your discussion spoke about how those people will say things like the things they're putting up with chip away at them and lead to situations where they feel they have to complain. And that speaks to informal resolution, right? So in those meetings, do you ask openly who the bullies are? Because people know who the bullies are. We know that they're promoted. We know that they exist and reside in the system, because in certain situations with the military, you literally just time them out. And that is part of the halo effect. That is something that comes in some of those other lessons. It was just Jimmy, And so I don't see that is tackled in your report. I also don't see that deployments and handling of events on operational matters is appropriately handled. So when units are sent away as formed units, very short periods of time, and people are just effectively told just to put up with it for the 4 months or so that they're away. Again, disproportionately impacts women because those people come from non-formed units. Can you provide a view on that, perhaps?
Absolutely, and I will start by saying I absolutely agree with everything you are saying. We are very limited in my jurisdiction that I can look at the things that are raised as formal service complaints. Actually, I rely quite a great deal on goodwill in that outreach visits and these conversations are something we've added in to the mix. When I have those conversations with individuals, we talk about atmospherics in that area. We talk about if there are any people who are a particular issue. I ask them about how they can raise concerns, whether they have raised concerns, what has been done about those concerns. And one of the things I do on those visits is feedback to the commanding officer at the end of that visit and let them know if there is anyone they should be concerned about or anything where they should be directing their focus. It's quite rare that somebody will say in those sessions, well, you know, it's this person, I want you to go after them.
Or it's the commanding officer.
There is also that risk. I think people are quite open with me about the commanding officer, about the attitude that they have and whether or not that has shifted. I think it's really interesting how when a commanding officer changes, it can change the entire vibe and the entire atmosphere. And the people who feel that the most keenly are the people in those sessions with me. Again, I don't pull any punches. If I have people telling me that the atmosphere has shifted towards the negative, I will be able to say that to the commanding officer. In terms of, and I just want to pull it back just slightly, I think, to a comment you made that bullies love informal resolution. I am just going to challenge that slightly because I think one of the common misconceptions around informal resolution is that it's just everyone getting in a room and will just agree to let it go. I think informal resolution can have very tangible formal outcomes, but it's about the way the complaint is resolved and investigated. Informal resolution to me is the contrast to a paper-based investigation that has an investigating officer, a huge evidence file, but actually if informal resolution looks like individuals in a room talking about their experiences and a commanding officer saying, actually, I recognise the truth of what you're saying, I think there is a problem with that individual and I am going to take appropriate disciplinary action, that is a tangible outcome that has arisen from informal resolution. Okay, so I think as long as it's monitored.
But that's how Lucy Letby went by. And because your system isolates every case individually and doesn't allow patterns to be identified, informal resolution is something that benefits bullies.
Currently, it could be said to do so, but again, if we are able to deliver the recommendations 6.1 and 6.3, where everything comes through that front gate and is monitored and tracked, particularly with the new case management system that the services are using, where we can put a number of different tags on cases to be able to analyse the data in a way that we haven't before, we'll be able to see those trends.
Thank you very much. Mike Martin, please.
Very quickly on this topic, just to slightly develop it, we're soon to have an Armed Forces Commissioner. What advice would you give them about this particular issue, this idea of formalising the informal or keeping it informal? How would you advise them to draw the appropriate line between the two?
So, my main advice for the Commissioner would be to grasp this and run with it and take it with both hands. We have been campaigning for these additional powers for a long time because we are limited to only the things that come through the formal system. I think the Commissioner will have a huge amount of additional scope to go out and speak to more individuals, to have more rigorous conversations with the chain of command, with everyone in that chain around what are you doing about these sort of behaviours? Can you demonstrate to me? Can you show me all of the informal complaints that you've received? Can you show me the interventions you've made? And if not, why not? They will have that ability to do it, and I would love to see them taking forward that part of the work.
Carry on, yeah. We touched on it a little bit, but women are overrepresented in complainants. Why is that? And have you identified any trends over the last 2 to 3 years?
So one of our longest outstanding recommendations is recommendation 1.10, which is asking the Ministry of Defence to do that study into the root causes of that overrepresentation. Why are these demographics particularly overrepresented? It's certainly not the case that women are just better at complaining or more confident in coming forward, as has been said to me in a few meeting rooms, and I think you can imagine how I responded to that. But there is something that is happening. We have now seen some progress on this recommendation, and we've just received the first sort of cut of data from a report into all of the complaints raised by female personnel, anything that ties them together, anything that we can see that sort of speaks to those trends so that we can start some work going forward on it. But it has been too slow. We have been asking for that for a significant amount of time.
And what's your sense?
My sense is, when we look at women being represented in the armed force and we talk about them being 12% of service personnel, that 12% is not split evenly across all regiments, across all cap badges, across all areas. We know that there are areas where you have more women serving, most notably within the medical services. Within those areas, we don't tend to see a number of complaints coming from them, from their home units. But what we do see is that those are the sorts of career roles that then have to go out as attached to other units, to places where they don't have that same demographic split, where they're perhaps not as used to dealing with women in the workplace.
More of an all-male environment, and then...
Exactly. It's really hard to get behind that environment. If somebody isn't routinely working with women, seeing them every day, and it is just a predominantly male environment, it's not only hard to identify where you have issues, but it's hard to eradicate them, because by the time it's happened, it's too late. So my sense is that it's about that unequal split, and individuals are saying that they feel quite safe and quite content in their home units, and it's when they go out and interact with others that they are experiencing those difficulties.
Okay. And any trends in that over the last 2-3 years? Has that changed at all, or is that your sense that that's kind of what's
it's stayed pretty
it's
stayed pretty consistent. The sorts of things that people are complaining about under this umbrella of complaints has remained pretty constant.
How would you solve a problem like
that? A number of different ways, a number of different levers I would love to be able to pull if they were my levers. More women in the armed forces, more rigorous screening ahead of time. I don't know quite how you would achieve it, but in terms of when we employ people in the armed forces, can we make sure they are the right sort of people? Can we do something to check how they would respond to certain situations? I don't have the answer for that, but making sure
metric testing of recruits,
ensuring that we're not bringing people in with that inherent bias, with those poor behaviours. And
leadership, one assumes, is critical. You mentioned more women in the armed forces, more women leaders.
Leadership is absolutely critical. More women leaders is naturally something I would be very much in favour of. Due to the hierarchical nature and the way that careers progress, we need to get the demographic split right at the front end, and that will flow through, and that will naturally take a lot of time. So while we are in that situation, we also need to look at our male leaders and how well they are calling out what they see. I present annually a session to the generalship programme at Sandhurst, and I talk about challenge culture. And one of the things I always talk to this session about is it's really easy to say to people, be an active bystander, speak up when you say things. What I have fed back to them, and what they've maybe not realised, is that when I speak to individuals on outreach visits, they always have this inherent idea of who is the person of rank in the room. So if they see poor behaviours in the mess, in the barracks, they know what they should be calling out. But if there is someone of a higher rank in the room who has also seen it, to call it out would not only be calling out the behaviour, but also calling out the inaction of their superior. So there is always this assumption that whoever is the highest ranking person in the room should be the person to call it out. And so making sure that leaders are aware of that, are aware that that is a reason why people themselves might not speak up and step in, and making sure they are alive to all of those behaviours and actively looking for them to be able to call them out is something we need to drive with them.
The standard you walk past is the standard that you accept.
Absolutely.
Now, you speak of talking at the generalship level, but actually probably the key rank is lieutenant colonel or equivalent, right? Because these are the commanding officers of units. So if you're a CO of an infantry battle group and you've got attached, that's a predominantly a male organisation, but you've got women who are attached from the medical services. And are you aware, or have you yourself done interventions on ACSC, for instance, which is the staff course for lieutenant level command, to have those conversations and say, actually, it's extremely important that you set the tone and you call out that behaviour?
So yes and no. It's going to be a slightly long-winded answer, for which I apologise. We have had conversations with ACSC and would love to be able to get in and do more training. Again, I draw myself back to the fact that I am limited in my remit. My remit is only to look at service complaints. So there are a million areas I would love to get into and talk about this sort of thing. We are doing what we can, so we present quarterly to each of the services' new commanding officer course. We talk about service complaints, we talk about bullying, harassment, we talk about the ways that they can open themselves to both observing and halting this behaviour. We're currently in discussions trying to get in at the RSM level as well, because our experience is that while individually it's really important that the CO drives that culture, but actually for a new person, for a very junior serving person, they're not going to go directly to the CO to talk about their problems. They're going to go to their RSM, and actually making sure that person knows what is behaviour that can be dealt with, what is stuff that has to be escalated, and that they are open to the issues that individuals, particularly within marginalised demographics, are facing. That's really key for me, so I'm really excited to drive that work forward.
Okay. Ooh, and then just a really quick one to finish off. Reservists are underrepresented in complainants. Do you know why that is?
Short answer, no. We don't know exactly why it is. reservists, by the nature of their work, when we do see complaints from reservists, it tends to be more from the full-time reserve service because they are full-time in that career. Whether or not there is a split between, of the full-time reserve service, are they proportionally raising the same number of complaints as normal service personnel? We haven't done any sort of analysis and delving into that. I would like the ability to do that. We are also looking to get some engagement and outreach with some reserve units this year because it is an area where we haven't done a lot of outreach and heard a lot of direct feedback.
So, and could I posit that if reservists are experiencing bullying and harassment or, inappropriate sexual behaviour, actually, rather than complain, they're just going to walk, and then we're losing quality people because the culture's not right? I mean, do you think that there might be some truth to that?
There absolutely could be some truth to that. I think, as I mentioned, if people don't get the outcomes to complaints they want, they vote with their feet. Similarly, if people don't feel that they can raise complaints or that they're not being heard or not being represented, they will simply choose to stop serving.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Michelle Scroggin, please.
Thank you. You noted an increase in the complaints since 2022. Has that trend continued into 2024?
Yes, it has. I will caveat this with the fact that we are currently in the process of drafting the annual report. We get the final data cut at the end of January 2025, so I don't have the exact figures. But one of the recommendations we made in a previous year, 6.2, was that the services send us quarterly updates on their volumes and their issues, so we do have a good overview of it. There are slight fluctuations between the service, but broadly we are looking at a 30% increase again this year. That means that over the course of 3 years, the number of service complaints admitted by the services has more than doubled.
Okay. Do you have any insight into the factors behind that increase?
So there are a number of things it could be attributed to. I believe it is a combination of all of them. So accessibility and visibility of the system. We now have the My Complaints app. So rather than having to understand which JSP you use to raise your service complaint and print off the form and fill it out longhand, there is now an app, there is an area on DefNet and Defence Gateway where you can get information on service complaints and just submit your complaint online. So we have improved the accessibility and visibility of the system. We have also tried to do that as SCOAF through our outreach work, through our media work, through trying to raise the profile of this system. And the services won't thank me for saying it, but I welcome the increase in the number of complaints. We know from AFCAS that not enough people complain, so I would like to see that number continually going up. One of the things we do see is that a number of the complaints that would have been resolved by the chain of command at a low level are now coming directly into that central admissibility through the app. And that's why 6.1 and 6.3 are so important for me, because it's great that we have that overview of them, but actually they don't necessarily need to be assigned to an investigating officer and a decision body. They just need resolving.
You seem to be of the opinion that it's more about people are able to complain easier than that there are more issues to complain about.
I think so. There is nothing I've seen in my time in role that indicates to me that behaviours are getting materially worse. It is, I think, that people are more comfortable to complain.
Would you say there are any specific trends around the issues with the complaints that are coming forward?
Again, nothing that is dramatic or of particular concern. So we tend to see little bursts of complaint. There will be one issue that comes up and then suddenly we'll have a little spate of complaints perhaps from one service. But overall, the complaints are what we would expect to see. So in terms of career management, they tend to focus on annual reporting and appraisals, positions in the order of merit, success or otherwise at promotion boards, choice of appointment postings. Within bullying, harassment, discrimination, that goes again from the unacceptable sexual behaviour and direct discrimination, all the way down to that sort of breakdown of working relationships and how people feel and how people are treated while they're trying to do their jobs. Within terms and conditions of service, and this is a really interesting one, we tend to see a split into two areas. One is that policy has not been applied correctly or fairly to my situation, and the other is a much more wide-ranging, that policy itself is not fair, is not right for service personnel. And those are the things we tend to see.
And when you're actually looking at those complaints, how weighted, when you're looking at those individual issues, would you say that someone is successful more? So whether it's a sexual harassment issue or something to do with their career progression, what would be the weighting to how many are successful in their complaints to each of those individuals?
I'm afraid I can't give you a figure at this point because we don't have the data. When complaints are upheld, they're recorded on the system by the services as either upheld or partially upheld. And that has historically been something that really restricts our analysis. Because if somebody raises 10 heads of complaint, 2 of which are about their annual report, 8 of which are about behaviours, and there was found to be 1 small procedural error in their annual report, that complaint will be recorded as partially upheld. If the annual reporting was fine, but all 8 complaints are upheld in terms of the way they were treated, whether or not they were bullied, that will also be recorded as partially upheld, so they will look identical within the system. One of the things we're looking to drive forward under the new case management system is the ability to pick out those heads of complaint, what each of those complaints were about, and whether or not they were upheld, so we can see, is there one type of complaint that is more likely to be upheld?
Thank you.
Thank you. I believe Lincoln Job wanted to come in on this point as well.
Yep, Commissioner. Sorry, Ombudsman. Slip of the tongue.
Right, just for the record, no commissioner has been appointed.
I'm interested in this. I'm interested in this phenomenon that you're describing of the complaining culture increasing rather than the behaviour declining. Do you have visibility of, is there any sort of clustering effect around a unit, a trade? Do you have visibility of could you do that analysis from what the information you get in order to see that, well, actually, that's traditional or becoming traditionally much more complaining than that?
So, broadly, I cannot, but we as an umbrella can. So I can only see the cases that apply to my office, and then I get the overall data from the services at the end of it. What the services will see when those complaints come in is what was the originating unit, what is the complaint about, and they will monitor those hotspots, and that's something they discuss with me very regularly in our catch-ups. One of the issues we see is that individuals may not raise their complaints until they are out of that environment, so the complaint will be recorded at the unit they're in now, but that's not actually where the issue was, so we have to be alive to that. We also see issues of intertwined complaints where one individual will complain and you might then see a retaliatory complaint or somebody who, in talking with that individual, says, well, actually, I've been subject to that behaviour as well and I am also going to raise my complaint. And so we have to have some sensible conversations around which complaints you can pause to allow other procedures to take place, which ones you should join. One of the things we're seeing at the moment is a mass of complaints around accommodation. And there's a number of complaints, around 4,000, that are in around single living accommodation and associated issues with that. The service complaint system is not designed to deal with that level of mass complaints, but it is absolutely right that individuals can use that system because it is something that affects them in their service life. So when we start to see things like that, if we see particular areas leaping up in volumes, we have to be alive to it and we have to be able to pick up on those. One of the things we also factor in when we plan our outreach for the year is what complaints did we see last year? What complaints did the services see? Is there anywhere that we think we would have particular benefit going and speaking to people? And that's as much, is there a hotspot for complaints? Is there somewhere where we have a particular overrepresentation of a demographic and it would be useful for me to speak to them? But also, just as worrying, is there anywhere that I have not seen a single complaint from? Because absolutely I would expect to see complaints in the workplace, and if somebody doesn't have any complaints, that to me is just as much of a red flag. So we use that to factor into the discussions on our outreach and where we're going to focus our efforts.
Speaking of which, I did notice in your report that 3 complaints were raised against your office and that one of them was upheld and an apology issued, which is a pretty shocking strike rate and worse than all 3 of the services as far as I can work out. Can you please describe to us the nature of that complaint and what lessons you took from the resolution thereof?
Absolutely. So when we talk about complaints raised against our office, it is broadly complaints about the way we have handled someone's application and their investigation and their sort of processing through our part of the service. We don't get very many. We have individuals who are unhappy with the outcome, and that is one of the necessities of complaints handling, is that individuals will be unhappy with the outcome. But where they are escalated as complaints, they tend to focus on whether or not we have followed our correct investigative procedures, whether or not we've been as clear as we could be, and whether or not we have followed all the things that we need to do. I would need to look into the specific one to which you're referring, but one of the things we have taken forward from the complaints we've received is a complete revision of our operating practices and a complete revision of our operating manual to ensure that all of our investigators know the correct processes, that that document is frequently updated, and that we are doing our best to make sure. Because at the end of the day, it is so damaging if somebody has been through a complaints process and is unhappy with the outcome and then comes to my office and receives a poor service. That just cements that feeling, and so we need to do everything we can to make sure that that does not happen again.
But there was only one of three, and you can't tell us what it was about.
I can't. Because I am the Ombudsman, I am the ultimate arbiter of those decisions. Ordinarily, complaints are handled by my head of investigation and also my chief of operations. So bear in mind this is now sort of further than 12 months ago. I would have to look into which specific one is referred to in 2023, but I'm more than happy to write to you on that fact.
Thank you.
Thank you. We now want to delve into the interaction with the Armed Forces Covenant. Alex Baker, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ombudsman. So this committee has just launched an inquiry into the Armed Forces Covenant as it stands, because we are very keen, obviously, to influence the legislation coming forward where, through the Armed Forces Bill, this government is looking to put the covenant into law. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions relating to the covenant as it stands. In what areas is the Armed Forces Covenant working well?
And again, I am going to caveat this with I am not best placed to tell you where the covenant is working well because my focus is on the service complaint system. But the issues that people raise with us that sometimes can and cannot be part of the service complaint system do indicate where there are areas for concern, which I think will be well known to the committee. Things like accommodation, provision of childcare services, ability to access medical services. Those are the sorts of things that people bring to us and end up quite frustrated because the service complaint system itself cannot handle those. I'm really pleased to see that Secretary of State has allowed for serving personnel to give evidence to the inquiry on the covenant, because I think that is where you will get the most rich data from what people are actually seeing and experiencing.
Have you got any personal view on, it's interesting to hear where you think it's failing, but have you got any personal view of where you think the covenant is actually doing its job as it stands?
I would struggle to highlight anywhere where I have a personal view or personal experience of it.
Okay. And in terms of that failing piece, I mean, you've obviously listed a few things there. Is there any, we're interested in, is that the full breadth of where you think the covenant is failing as it stands?
Those are the main areas in the work that has come through to my office. I'm aware of a few cases where individuals have expressed concern because the intention to provide a service or support or infrastructure is there, but the local area is not able to provide it. I think the concern for me in this work on the covenant and in bringing it into law is the potential for complication around if it's found that the covenant is not working. Where are we able to take those complaints and where should that focus be? Is it on local providers? Should it come through the service complaints process? And how will individuals be able to raise those issues? And it's something I think the Armed Forces Commissioner would be very interested in.
And so are there any areas which you think that the Armed Forces Covenant ought to be extended to? And, why?
I'm afraid I don't have enough experience of how well it's working to be able to give a view as to whether or not I would see it extended.
Okay, and if so, we're putting it into law, and you've just sort of talked about some of the challenges you might see from that. If putting it into law could achieve, one thing for you, what would that be?
The biggest thing for me, I think, is the promise to service personnel that is being taken seriously. Putting it into law shows that commitment to making sure that the things we set out in the covenant, that we say to service personnel, you will not face disadvantage, you will be supported, you will be treated fairly. It is being taken seriously and it is being looked after by Parliament, by the government. That, I think, is the biggest thing it will achieve.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you very much. Lincoln Job, please.
What interaction have you had with service families, if any?
Very little, I'm afraid, and again, not through lack of desire to on my part, but simply because my remit is very, very limited to only service complaints and only to the applications that come directly to my offices. We occasionally get contact from individuals who are family members of service personnel, and we do our best to point them towards organisations that can help them. I have met a few members of service personnel family just simply through events and through outreach, but in terms of formal engagement, we do not have the jurisdiction for it. But I think it is a huge positive that the Armed Forces Commissioner will be able to have that contact.
The German model doesn't allow Armed Forces personnel's family to approach their commissioner. They have to funnel it, as your remit currently is, via the service person. What additional, what are the pros and cons of extending it out, the remit of the commissioner to service families?
I think the comparison with the German model is really interesting. That role has been in existence for more than 65 years. The annual report for the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Armed Forces in Germany covers the operation of defence as a whole. So they have a much wider remit in terms of the things they're looking at. But they also don't have the same direct powers of intervention in service complaints that SCOAF has, or that our Armed Forces Commissioner will inherit. With opening it up to bringing representations from families, I think it is really important. I think it will be of absolute benefit. I mentioned when I spoke in the scrutiny committee that individuals often are not comfortable talking about the things that affect them, particularly when it's affecting their mental state, their welfare, and actually family members are the ones who see it and who feel it and who are living with it. So actually the ability for them to bring those issues in and say, look, this is really affecting someone, is going to give us a huge amount to work with. I think with the German system, because the remit is so wide, if you opened that up to family members on all the issues that Dr. Hughes is permitted and required to look at, the volume would be astounding. But because our Armed Forces Commissioner will be looking at welfare matters, I think you will see an increase in volume with bringing it open to the family, but I think it is the right thing to do. Because not only are they the ones who observe things that are happening with their own service personnel that might not normally be raised, they are people who are directly affected by some of these welfare matters. When we talk about housing, when we talk about medical provision, when we talk about pay and allowances, they are supporting their service person, they are raising families with them, they are trying to maintain their own career while allowing their partner to work in this very important area. They are not subject to service law, they don't have rights under the service complaint system, but they are subject to service life. And so it is absolutely vital that they have access to the Commissioner and can raise the issues that are affecting them.
But you could be quite broad in your application of the word welfare, couldn't you?
Yes.
I think Rommel said the best form of welfare is better training, because better training means fewer widows. And so the Commissioner, by looking at the welfare brief, could actually be exploring, as the German Commissioner is, equipment, she interprets it pretty broadly, and it's a sort of go anywhere pass, so to do.
So I would expect the secondary legislation and the regulations to be drafted to put some sort of steer on that, to include a sort of, this is including but not limited to, these are the main areas of focus that we would like to include under welfare. I think the danger you have is if we try and launch into this with everything being up for grabs, the risk is that you absolutely overwhelm the First Commissioner, that they try to look at everything and are not able to do so in sufficient detail as to create any reports with impact that give tangible outcomes or things that we can look to improve. So I think it will be for the Commissioner working with the implementation team and with the Ministry of Defence to say this is what we mean by welfare, but actually for the first 2, 3, 5 years, these are the areas of focus because these are the things we know are important. This is where we will focus work in the first 12 to 24 months. And in that time, we will also take representation and petition from family members, from service personnel, to find out what else we should be looking at going forward. Just because they can look at everything doesn't mean they should look at everything. It'll be about that balance and focusing where they can have the most impact.
I'm struck by your evidence this morning where I think you said earlier on there are 1,000,001 areas I would like to get into. And I just remind you of that. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. Time, resource, enthusiasm, but yes, there are a number of different ways I think the Armed Forces Commissioner could have a really positive impact. We can't try to say the royal we, the Office of the Armed Forces Commissioner can't try to fix everything all at once. but there are a number of issues that we are already alive to that would make for very, very interesting work and very positive work, I think.
Thank you very much. At this point, I'd also like to place on record my gratitude to the Secretary of State for confirming the granting of our committee's request for service personnel to be able to contribute to our Armed Forces Covenant inquiry, which, as you noted earlier, will make sure that it is a lot more productive. I now want to go back to the annual report. And we will be looking on progress on previous recommendations. Derek Twigg, please.
Yeah, so the simple question is, are you monitoring the progress on the previous recommendations and whether the deadlines which were set out in the government response have been met?
So absolutely we are monitoring them. Again, caveat, I feel like I'm caveating everything today, for which I apologise. The formal decision on whether or not recommendations are closed or open will be issued along with the annual report, but I can absolutely give you an update on the progress. We meet regularly with the MOD to talk about the progress on these recommendations, and as the committee will be aware, last year we chose not to make any new recommendations for the reason that it had taken so long to seek agreement on the previous ones that nobody had had a chance to progress them. And when we make recommendations, we're not doing it for fun, we're doing it because we think it will have a positive impact. And I wanted to be able to see the benefit of those recommendations before we move on. So in terms of the recommendations outstanding from the 2022 annual report, recommendation 7.1 was about the need to standardise and professionalise case handling. And we've seen some really interesting work on this.
So the new complaints case management system?
So that is one element of it.
Yeah.
And
so
a lot of
has that been there?
The new case management system is up and running, and as part of that, in order to understand how cases move through, all of the process flows had to be mapped for each of the services, and that allowed a standardisation and a bringing together of how complaints are handled. We've also done a tri-service workshop on maximising caseloads, efficiencies, how large-scale organisations deal with working with complaints, and that was really useful work. So we are definitely making progress in that area, and the case management system is a big part of making sure that that works. Recommendation 7.2 was about that visibility in that central area online where people can access complaints. That is up and running. Recommendation 7.3 I am very excited about. This was the opportunity for SCOAF to dip sample and quality review cases that we would ordinarily never get to see. The process for that has been fully designed and is up and running. We have completed.
It was met by November then, was it?
It was, yes. The services had their cases to us by November, and SCOAF were able to complete our review by mid-December. So we have completed our first round of that, and we are really excited about that work. And similarly, we have the standard operating procedure in a shared area set up where all recommendations and changes, whether instigated by my office, by the Ministry of Defence, by committee suggestion, are all now recorded in one place with an agreed schedule for how they are reviewed, how they are measured, how they are monitored, because we can't lose focus of what is the proposed impact of this change. I think too often previously we've said, right, we'll do this, or these are all the recommendations arising from this report, and we need to be able to stop and look back and say, did that have the effect we wanted, and if so, what further work needs doing? So there has been some delay in delivering those, but we have seen a lot of activity this year, and I am very pleased with it.
But the review to determine the root cause of the overrepresentation of female and BAME personnel to service committees, that was by December. That should have been done by.
So we have had the initial report. I have had a look through it. It looks very useful. It looks very comprehensive. I am very pleased with the quality of what has been done. What we are in discussions about now is how we formalise that happening again on a regular basis to make sure that this is not just a one shot and done, that this is something the services are looking at continually.
So a thorough and proper review has taken place and was in your hands by December?
Yes.
Yeah, that's been okay. Okay, just obviously you talked about making any recommendations in the 2023 report. So are you expect to make any new recommendations in your next and possibly final report?
Yes, I will be making new recommendations. I don't think it'll.
You can't tell us what they are.
I don't think it will surprise the committee that I cannot tell you what they are. Still being fleshed out, but. Essentially, we will never get to a point where there are no new recommendations to be made. The landscape is always changing, and as it changes, the interventions and the extra things that need doing will change along with it. This is a journey of continuous improvements. So there will always be new recommendations. There will be some going into this report, but they will seek to add to the work that has been previously done. We're not seeking to reinvent the wheel.
Okay, thanks for that. Can I just ask you a specific question going back? Obviously, a lot of focus has been on the complaints around bullying and harassment for obvious reasons, rightly so. But actually, the largest number of complaints was career management, which is 35%. Can you give us any insight? Because, I mean, obviously anything like putting arrest, any sort of complaint can affect morale, but in terms of career management, in terms of a widespread issue, in terms of if people think they can't progress or get properly treated fairly in the career, then obviously morale-wise that can have a major impact as well. So I just wondered any insights into what's sort of underlying that career management, being the more sizable complaints that we've got.
There are a number of things I think that drive that area of complaints, and one is the way that career management is done in the armed forces. Yeah. It is a very strict, regimented process. You know, everyone has to have reporting. Reporting has to be done a specific way. It has to be done by a specific date, and there are a number of steps in each of those things that have to happen by a certain date. With any process that is that involved, there are opportunities for it to go wrong, and some of the complaints we see are about my report wasn't issued on time. I was expecting to receive it by this date and I didn't. Yeah. So simple procedural issues. We also look at the fact that when going into a career in the armed forces, individuals have a level of expectation of how their career will progress and how it will go. That whole sort of, in this many years I would expect to be here or achieving this. And then when those aspirations don't match up with their experience, we can see complaints around that. It is a very, very competitive area. You know, when people are going for promotions and there are individuals needing to be ranked by performance for everyone in their rank group and then being put forward to compete for a limited number of jobs, there are naturally going to be people who think, I have been career fouled if I don't get the career I want. And so much of that career management and promotion is on the strength of that annual report. You know, a couple of pages put together by your chain of command, by your first and second reporting officers, is what has the power to decide if you get promoted and if you get the appointment you want. And so much rides on this small document that goes through a very, very engaged process that I think there are naturally a number of reasons why complaints would arise from that.
Thank you very much. We now want to move on to the functioning of the SCOAF office. Calvin Bailey, please.
Just to take you back, do you have a view on stratification then? So you were talking about performance and the impact of first and second ROs when people are graduated and given a number against their report. This has a significant impact on them. It's completely unregulated, uncontrolled, and has a massive impact on people's performance. Do you have a view? Is that something that falls out?
I would hesitate to call it unregulated and sort of unobserved. What we have seen is that the majority, if I use the Army as an example, where career management is one of the largest areas, all of their career management complaints go through to APC, to the Army Personnel Centre, and they have the best handling times in terms of dealing with those complaints, and they have really good outcomes in terms of it. So they are absolutely on that. What we've also seen is some really good lessons learned where they've taken it and said, even though these complaints weren't upheld, we can see that this is causing us an issue, and therefore we're going to train our first reporting and second reporting officers in how to avoid all these sorts of issues.
So you don't have any concerns about racking and stacking then of people?
Not as such.
Okay. We can explore that later. On to the function of the SCOAF office then. How effectively is your team currently working?
We are functioning very well at this point in time. I think the committee will be aware that historically performance at SCOAF has been a concern, and we did face a backlog which historically peaked at around 149 cases and cases taking over a year to allocate. Last time I spoke in front of the committee in late 2023, we were down to about 49 cases and we were looking at about 8 months to allocate. We are currently at, when I took on the role, we were at 49 cases in 8 months, and when I last spoke to the committee, we were at 18 cases in a 2.5 month wait, apologies. We currently have no backlog at all. We have no wait to allocate cases, so as soon as applications come into my office, they are able to be assessed and then passed through to investigators, and timeliness is vastly improved. We are currently at 99% against a target of 90% to do all our cases. That's been delivered without any increase in staffing or funding, and we've actually released the use of our fee-earning investigators, who are a contingent force that we brought in to help deal with that backlog. And that's also in the face of applications to SCOAF have gone up, similar to, we talk about the service complaint system having more than doubled in 3 years. That flows through to us and we see that same increase. So last year, admissibility applications more than doubled, and substance and maladministration investigations, which are our biggest, chunkiest casework, increased by nearly 50% last year. So the fact that we've been able to deliver that performance with no increased staffing, no increased budget, and an increased volume is really testament to how hard the team have worked, how much they have brought into it, and the enthusiasm they have brought into it. They want to do a really good job, and they are rightfully very, very proud of what they have achieved. And just to put it on the record, I am very proud of them as well. We did it a number of ways. We undertook a comprehensive operational review. We stripped out anything that we could in terms of unnecessary administration on cases. Any time we were double handling, any time there was wait time unnecessarily in our processes. We changed the way we write. We changed our reports to make them easier to write for our people, but also easier to read for the individuals who are accessing our service. And that, I think, has really improved that case handling. We've also done a significant amount of work, and that then forms part of 7.1 and what we've tried to cascade out to the services around optimal case holding. How many cases should my guys have at any one time to make sure that they've got enough work to be getting on with, they're able to progress it in line with timeframes, but that they're not overloaded? And we've reached the correct balance with that now, so we are keeping pace with what's coming in.
Okay, and rightfully, I'd posit that that is a reflection on your leadership, and it is impressive performance, and that's something that you should take great credit for yourself. So what are the barriers that you foresee that stop the sustained performance?
Yeah, there's always a number of risks that come with this, and when you've hit 100% timeliness, there's very few other ways to go. Key thing for me in deciding how we were going to attack the backlog was that the quality of casework should not change. Absolutely inappropriate to look to reduce a backlog by changing the goalposts and allowing fewer cases in, or by devaluing the product that you put out. So I'm really, really pleased that there's no risk on that, but I think the risk we face is around burnout of my staff, around maintaining that enthusiasm, and around what we do if that volume continues to go up and we're not able to increase our staffing. Utilising our time and resource is really difficult, so we are able to keep pace at the moment, but the intention has always been to reduce that backlog so that staff have the opportunity to do other work as well, to be involved in the outreach visits, to speak directly to service personnel, to engage in the training courses, to do outreach and education. Currently, we have a number of gapped positions. We are caught up in the recruitment freeze, so we are keeping pace. However, my staff are only able to focus on casework at this point, and this affects both the operational and the business side. So we have a number of gapped positions. We are filling internally with temporary promotions, but it means that investigators and senior investigators have capacity to do the cases and nothing else. On the business side, we haven't had a comms manager for over a year. We currently have no stats manager, and we have to be very canny about how we upskill and train individuals so that we can cover those gaps, but it means that there is no room left for anything else at this point in time, and we could have more impact, we could give more value, we could do lots of extra work if we had the capacity. And that is what we had promised staff, is if we break the back of this backlog, there will be the opportunity to branch out and to do all of this value-added work. At the moment, I have made that promise, but I'm not able to deliver on it because we are just fighting to keep pace with it.
Thank you.
Just to delve into that, but why do you feel that you don't have the capacity?
We're not able to recruit to any gapped posts. So Ministry of Defence is in a recruitment freeze at the moment, and as part of Ministry of Defence, we are similarly caught by that.
Right, fair enough. All right, let's move on to Ian Room, please.
Yeah. I'm interested in the transition period between your office and your term and the Armed Forces Commissioner. You've talked about difficulties faced by your team when there was a gap between yours and your predecessor's terms as Ombudsman. What was the impact of that?
So, that was not an ideal situation, but it is one of the things that you can face when you are dealing with time-sensitive appointments and very, very rigorous recruitment processes. And quite rightly, you want an individual that can be properly scrutinised and held to account. But you risk the situation that I was in, which is where my predecessor's end date and my start date, due to the notice I had to give at my previous job, simply could not be aligned. Now, under SCOAF's legislation, unless there is an ombudsman in place, there is no power to be delegated. So nobody else who works for the SCOAF could do any work, could issue any cases. So that led, we had a period where there was simply no ombudsman. And what actually happened is I ended up taking this role in title a number of weeks before I took it in practice. So I was sort of carrying the responsibility and the legal responsibility, should anything have gone to JR, before I actually started in role as the Ombudsman. And that was not ideal. But it meant that people could keep issuing cases. And in a situation where backlog has always been a problem, that was something we wanted to make sure happened. So that risk is even more stark now, I think. I've mentioned my staff take a huge amount of pride in what they've delivered. If they are put in a situation where there is a gap and they are not able to progress casework and they can see that backlog increasing through something that was entirely preventable, that is going to be hugely detrimental to staff morale. You have an added layer of complication in this case that, when I was recruited to take over from my predecessor, I was taking on an existing role with an existing job spec. With the Armed Forces Commissioner, you'll be looking to recruit someone to a job spec and a job description that does not yet exist, and looking for the right sort of person to deliver the intention of secondary legislation and regulations that has not yet been drafted. And that puts you in a really, really sensitive place. The Armed Forces Commissioner legislation does have that provision that Secretary of State can put into place whatever transitionary arrangements are required, and that, I think, gives you a good level of security. But given where we are now, given that my term is due to end on the 31st of December 2025, and before the plans were announced for the Armed Forces Commissioner, so early summer 2024, preliminary work was already being done to start the recruitment process for my successor, so 18 months in advance. That sort of gives you a sense of how time critical this is.
Can I just come in on that? And is there opportunity to extend your term to out with that transition period? Because the Armed Forces Minister to the Public Bill Committee stated that it was going to be early next year that they were going to start, i.e. now, but to start in 2026. And obviously there's that transition period, and given your experiences from before, would you say that it's vital that the transition period for handover is essential period for the things that you've just mentioned?
So, a couple of different points in there. There is the opportunity to extend my contract as the Ombudsman, but it has been made very clear that the desire is to start from the 1st of January with an Armed Forces Commissioner, I think, going forward. That could either be done under those transitionary arrangements to say, actually, we're going to put someone in place for a transitionary period to help set up that legislation and to understand how the office will work, and then do a full appointment, or bring someone in as the Commissioner and say, right, we're starting from this date, but the first year will be setting up that work and understanding how it goes. I think identifying the individual is the key thing, as long as you've got that person in post. So I would also recommend looking at potentially a cut-off date. So, the legislation sets out that, if necessary, Secretary of State can make an interim appointment or a transitionary appointment to cover that gap. Although that wouldn't go through the full sort of pre-appointment scrutiny, you would still want that to be a person of the correct temperament and level. So there needs to be an understanding of where is the cut-off point, that if you have not got this sorted, you need to start looking at emergency situations.
Obviously, you've looked at the legislation of the Armed Forces Commissioner and what the role will undertake, and obviously it's got the expanded scope of being able to talk to families. What have you learned in your term of office that the new bill will bring in to ratify some of the complaints and recommendations much quicker? Do you feel that it's a positive way forward?
I think that it's a positive way forward. I think for me, from the complaints point of view, it gets after the biggest bugbear we have, which is people getting to the end of the complaints process and still feeling hard done by. Because the answer is, well, your complaint's not upheld because X, Y, and Z, but there is still an underlying sense of unfairness, a policy that's not right, or, if people are told you can't raise that complaint because actually it's about your husband and not you and you're only subject to service life, it gives that assurance that actually complaints and welfare as a whole is being looked at, and that to me is really important. The key thing, and this really struck me when looking at sort of the second reading and the scrutiny hearings, is the power that this role has will only be as powerful as the impact it is allowed to have based on what is done with those reports. It's not being suggested that the Armed Forces Commissioner will have the power to make budgetary decisions or decide how things are run within defence. So the onus will be on how is that commissioner going to be able to lay their reports, what gravitas is going to be given to those reports, and how seriously are those reports going to be taken to drive this forward. So I think there is a balance there.
And I mean that is important. And you mentioned earlier about you're only as good as the resources that you have got. So could I just ask, on behalf of the information for the committee, how big is your office at present? How many staff have you got?
We have budget allocation and headcount allocation for 26 posts, including myself. We are you going to test me now? I would have to tell you exactly how many. I believe currently we are holding gaps in 6 posts out of our 26.
And given the extra responsibilities of the Armed Forces Commissioner, do you see that resource having to increase?
Absolutely. Absolutely, 100%.
Yes. Thank you.
Sorry, 100% absolutely, not 100% by order of magnitude. I think the Commissioner will need to, again, coming back to that, how they will scale the work over the first few years, looking at how many applications you might get from family members will dictate how many people you might need in order to deliver that work. I think it'd be quite difficult to sit down and say, right, you need exactly these staff at this point in time, but there will necessarily need to be more staff simply because, if nothing else, the Armed Forces Commissioner is absorbing and taking on all the work of SCOAF. And we have the correct number of people to do that work. So anything else you want the Commissioner to do, they will require more staff.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Hughes, the service complaint system has never been determined to be either fair or effective or efficient. In your view, how far is it from being considered to be so?
Closer than it's ever been. And again, I apologise, caveat, the final assessment on efficient, effective and fair is being done at the moment as part of the annual report. But we've seen a constant journey of improvement over the last 4 years, particularly when we look at efficiency. So the KPI for resolving complaints is that 90% are done within a 24-week target. It's not been hit tri-service, but last year we hit 74%, and that was the 3rd or 4th consecutive year of improvements against that increased volume of complaints. I expect that to keep going up, so efficiency is improving. In terms of effectiveness, we are getting there. We are starting to see better learning from lessons, better cross-service collaboration, better ways of improving the complaint system. Fairness is the one that causes me the most concern, and it is the one where we still have one red rating because it's about disadvantaging and discriminating, and it's about the way that bullying, harassment, discrimination complaints adversely affect a few particular demographics and take longer. Those complainants are by definition disadvantaged by the system, but we will start to see them going forward improve.
Okay, so just on that point then, to take you back to stratification, racking and stacking, it's the single biggest factor that affects people's promotion and reporting. I note that sits firmly in that red, and yet you don't view that as a concern.
Sorry, so racking and stacking individuals for career management does not sit within that red.
No, I think it does. Does. Sorry, I don't see enough from within the port drawing pointing to saying, look, this is a real challenge to women and ethnic minorities in particular, where a reporting officer can have in the movement of a number that is completely unregulated, that you can have such a significant impact upon someone's career. I just can't see it controlled or discussed adequately.
So I understand the point you're making there. That red categorisation, when we look at all of those elements for efficient, effective and fair, we are looking at the operation of the service complaint system, not the career management. So if I were assessing issues within career management within the armed forces, that is absolutely something I might put in red. But what we are looking at is how the system itself deals with those complaints.
Right, thank you. We now want to move on to the Armed Forces Commissioner Bill and the transition and the timeline for that. The Minister for the Armed Forces, in his evidence to the Public Bill Committee, noted that he would like for the whole process, I think, to be completed and for the Commissioner's Office to be fully established at the start of 2026. Now, how satisfied are you personally with the transition and the introduction of the new Armed Forces Commissioner, how that is all being managed. How satisfied are you?
So when we talk about the Commissioner being in post and the office fully set up and fully functional from the 1st of January, it's a case of how long is a piece of string. If you are asking for that Commissioner to be appointed, to have all the additional staff they need, to have the secondary legislation and to have their operating procedures drawn up, I do not think that is achievable between now and then.
Right.
However, having someone in post, having the primary legislation, having the trust and confidence of the committee and that remit to say we are starting from now and this is the work I would like to do, that I think is achievable. In terms of the transition, obviously my staff are all aware of what's going on. They are aware that the core functions of SCARF are going to be absorbed into the Armed Forces Commissioner.
Your team has full clarity on the impact on them?
My team are aware that the work will be absorbed by the Commissioner. They have concerns. They are naturally slightly worried. They don't know what this means for them, for their terms and conditions, for their civil service status, for their pensions. Will they still be classed as being part of Ministry of Defence? Will they be able to do some of the work on the Commissioner side, or will they be sort of ring-fenced as SCOAF staff when that transition is done? They have a lot of questions, and unfortunately I can't answer them. So we do not have a lot of these answers at this point.
So you have no indication whatsoever as to whether those staff are being moved to the new Commissioner's office?
We have been given assurance that all current staff will be kept on and that they will simply come under a different name.
Right.
But actually, that doesn't give enough clarity for my staff in terms of, are they still MOD civil servants? And that sounds like a minor point, but when we are in a recruitment freeze where the only option for promotion is interdepartment transfer, that is really important to my guys. A lot of them place a lot of pride in their role as MOD civil servants, albeit under the umbrella of SCOAF. When I say that we don't have those answers, I don't intend that as a criticism. It's just that those answers don't exist yet.
Right, okay.
If it helps, my team are actually meeting with there is a new implementation manager who's been appointed to help sort of move the Armed Forces Commissioner stuff through. They have just recently started enrolled today, I believe, and we are meeting with them with our whole team later today. So those conversations are starting, but the work is still at very early stages.
Okay. I also believe Michelle Scroggum wants to come in on this point as well.
Yeah, talking about the freeze on the MOD hiring, is that going to have an impact on bringing people into the Armed Forces Commissioner's office? Will that have an impact on recruitment?
Difficult to say, not necessarily for me to say. I would hope and I would urge that in the creation of this office and the importance that is being placed on this, that there is dispensation given to say, right, we need at least this many people to be able to start and we are allowed to recruit to those posts. I've set out my view that you would need to sort of phase that up and start building that office as you get a sense of the volume, as you get a sense of the areas of focus. I would really hate to see all this legislation go through and this office be set up and then not be able to increase headcount to the level required to have the impact that is desired from this role.
Right, thank you. Also, I believe Ian Room wants to come in on this point.
Yeah, with the recruitment freeze, is that having a direct impact on complaints being investigated?
So it's not within my office, so we're still able to allocate cases. We're not overburdening staff. They are still at the optimum case handling, but it means that we are not able to free them up to do additional work. But it's not affecting the output of our main product, which is investigations into people's complaints. We've had to draw back on other things to be able to maintain that core function.
Can I ask, is there an average time that a case is open? In other words, how many cases have you got open today?
Currently 19.
19. Okay, thank you.
Right, thank you. I will now move over to comparisons with the German system, and I also want to place on record my thanks to Dr. Eva Hergel for her time for a comprehensive meeting with the Defence Committee wherein we could learn more from the German experience. But to discuss further into this, Emily Buck, please.
Thank you, Chair. Morning, Ombudsman. Your role has significant independence. Under the German model that we're told the new Commissioner is going to be based on, that independence doesn't really seem to be there. From my reading of it, the Secretary of State will have power over the appointment, over funding, over staffing, and they can dismiss the Commissioner if they deem them unfit. He's essentially their boss. Do you have concerns around that?
So, under the German system, and forgive me if any of this is incorrect, but obviously I know Dr. Eva Hergel quite well, and we've had conversations about the differences in our system and how they're set up. So the process of appointing the parliamentary commissioner in Germany is very, very different. It's not done by open application. It's not done by people being able to put themselves forward for the job. Individuals are nominated by the political parties for filling that post. I know Eva. I have the greatest of respect for Eva, and I do not think that affects her independence at all. But perceptually, looking externally, the idea that you're able to recruit for a commissioner by having it be an open competition, by having that person have pre-appointment scrutiny in front of the HCDC, I think is really important to maintain that independence, to demonstrate externally that this is being scrutinised. In terms of the Secretary of State having the power to dismiss a commissioner, I mean, currently that's in my terms and conditions now. There are a number of sort of safeguards within that, though, in that it can only be done for certain reasons. It can only be done under certain circumstances. One of the things I would expect to see is that is also set out in the terms and conditions of appointments for the Armed Forces Commissioner.
I was particularly concerned about if the Secretary of State deems the new commissioner to be unfit. Is that in the current you were saying there's you can be dismissed. Is that unfit element in the dismissal?
I have to double check, but I believe it is.
That's someone's opinion, isn't it? And this is the point I'm making: is that it seems like the Secretary of State is going to have a lot of power here over the new commissioner. Will that not impact on their independence?
I think I would have to check, and I'm very happy to write to the committee and provide a copy of my current terms and conditions for full transparency. I believe under mine it's set out as unfit in the sense of being unable to carry out the statutory functions of my role, as opposed to unfit, just don't really get on with them, don't really like what they're saying. So I would expect that same sort of level of protection to be put in. One of the things that I think is really important is, as a member of the Ombudsman Association, we have to go through the validation committee. And one of the things that the validation committee looks at is the terms and conditions of appointing the head of the organisation, so the Ombudsman, or as will be the Commissioner. If they have concerns that there is not sufficient independence, they will not revalidate this office. So it is in everyone's best interest to make sure that, you want someone who can speak that truth to power, who can write the reports that have the uncomfortable truth in it and not risk losing their job because somebody doesn't like the content of the reports.
So you're not worried that the new commissioner role will lack the independence because of the Secretary of State's control over it?
Provided that HCDC are allowed to do pre-appointment scrutiny, provided that, and I know the chair raised it in the sort of in the second reading around making sure that any concerns raised by this committee are taken seriously, and any reasons for going against the recommendations of the committee are fully explained and sort of put in the public sphere. I think this is the area where we maintain that independence and we maintain that scrutiny, that just because the Secretary of State has the power, I wouldn't necessarily expect to see them needing to exercise that, because I would want the Commissioner to be called regularly in front of this committee to account for their actions, to account for their reports, and to be held to account for their performance.
And just in terms of the questions earlier from my colleague, you've got 26 staff at the moment and 26 posts and 6 unfilled. What's your current budget?
Just over 2 million, I believe. I'm going to say 2.1 or 2.19 for this year. Again, it escapes me the exact number right now, unfortunately, but it is around that level and has been at that level for the last few years.
Okay, so we've been told that the new budget will be between 4.5 and 5.5 million. Do you think that's sufficient to cover the extended remit of speaking to service families?
Again, we kind of end up in a how long is a piece of string. I think just to put on record, the current budget that SCOAF has for operation is sufficient. We are not raising concerns that we need additional budget to do what we have to do. The issue is filling the posts. We have the budget for the posts, but we can't put people in them. So the budget is not a concern necessarily from our side. In terms of what the budgetary requirements and the staffing requirements for the Commissioner will be, you've got to look at the fact that all of the work of SCOAF is being taken on, so that is the minimum. That is what will need to be going forward. You'll require additional staff, you'll have additional things coming in, there will need to be additional legislation, there will need to be more reports. The team that help with putting together the annual reports, with laying stuff in Parliament, that is going to expand. The visibility, the comms, the outreach, all of that needs to expand. Depending on how that transition is managed, though, SCOAF have a IT system that functions very well, we have a website that is fit for purpose, we have office accommodation at the moment that could be extended. So it's not necessarily a case of just creating another extra one and doubling it, but the proposed budget doesn't feel unreasonable for an Armed Forces Commissioner in full operation. I would expect the first few years that they would require perhaps slightly less budget as they start to ramp up and build all of those things, but as an ongoing operational budget, it doesn't strike me as wildly out of the realms of possibility.
Thank you. Vice Chair.
Yeah, I am pleased that the Secretary of State on the floor of the House did confirm, which he followed up with a fuller explanation in a letter to the committee, to say that there will be a robust, he fully expects there to be a robust pre-appointment hearing by the committee, and that the views of the committee, especially if we have any serious concerns, that they will be seriously looked into to ensure that the appointment is as independent as can be. Now, just to go back, Ms. Hughes, we spoke earlier about a number of challenges to how the system could be deemed to be either fair or effective or efficient. Is there anything thus far that we have not covered which you would like to place on the record?
Don't believe so. Nothing of concern that needs placing on the record. What I would like to place on the record, if I may, is that all those positive shifts we've seen over the last 4 years, a huge part of that has been a shift in attitude with the services. When I took on this role, very much the Ombudsman was seen as the organisation that told people off and wrote criticisms but didn't necessarily actively help. What we are seeing now is a much more collaborative discussion where if we identify something that needs to change, the services and the MOD are so much more willing now to sit in a room with us and say, right, we all agree that this is the issue, how do we fix it together? And what we've started to see is the services taking as much pride and ownership and investment in delivering a good product as SCOAF is. That I would like on record, that I'm very grateful for those efforts. I will still hold the services to account, we will still disagree, we will still butt heads, but they have really grasped the importance of doing this, and some of those improvements would not have been possible without that collaborative working.
Okay, some of us have raised this issue on the floor of the House, as well as in committee, that we've seen significant challenges to recruitment and retention within our armed forces. Do you think that the introduction of an Armed Forces Commissioner, as currently drafted, do you think that that can help to overcome some of those challenges in recruitment and retention?
I think it will help identify some of the issues. It won't actively be able to fix it. So understanding from people what is affecting them, why they are choosing to leave, the things that, ideally identifying those issues before people choose to leave, those things that we describe as the constant background niggles and grumbles that are affecting their well-being day to day, we can flag those up. The Commissioner will be able to shine a light on those, and hopefully then through interventions people will be able to get ahead of that and improve those situations before people choose to leave.
Thank you very much. Ms. Hughes, thank you for coming before the Defence Committee. Also, please do convey to your team our gratitude for your service, for their service to the country. It is greatly appreciated. And with that, I'd like to bring this evidence session to a close. Order, order.